Wikidata has a ton of beautiful cans of worms, as we discussed in the Pink Pony session just now. And one of those cans of worms is ontology issues. And this is what we want to talk about now. Medrick is rightfully asking, is what we have actually really an ontology? And we can get into that discussion as well. But let's see. So why do we even care about issues in our ontology? Right now, using Wikidata as a source of knowledge to build an application or service or whatever requires effort. And it requires effort that some smaller reusers are not able or willing to invest. Which is sad, because then our data isn't being used to help spread knowledge and so on. So one of the things that makes it hard are ontology issues or problems in our ontology. They, for example, lead to unexpected query results and relations between items. There's inconsistencies between similar concepts that are differently modeled, for example, and sometimes even simple inference, so trying to deduct things like, if this person is the child of this other person, then their parent is probably the grandparent, and simple inferences like that can even have problems when our ontology has problems. And again, this is especially problematic for smaller and medium-sized reusers, because they don't have the time, energy, and resources to really figure this all out and work around some of the issues. Now, my team and I earlier this year, and we've presented this also at the Data Quality Days, we looked at a lot of existing research, a lot of existing discussions in the Wiki project Ontology, for example, and in other places. And we really tried to understand what's going on. And this is the phase we're in now. And then we want to figure out which ones of those are most important, and then find ways like new tools, new improvements to UI, new improvements to APIs, and so on, to make those issues occur less often or make them less likely. So what we have now is a draft for a classification of what different types of ontology issues do we even have, because there's definitely not just one type of ontology issue. And it makes a lot of sense to differentiate between them, because some of them are more important or more severe than others. And yes, Arthur is linking to the Wiki project's ontology, where there are some examples, and this is one of the things we've looked at. So we came up with this overview and that we would like feedback on. And there's several types of issues that I will now go into. One of the things we've been seeing is what we call semantic drift. So this is where relationships between entities, subclasses, are shifting slightly, so that in the long chain, the beginning and the end doesn't make sense anymore. So for example, here we have clarinet, and then that is an instance of occurrence or something, which in each of the individual steps of the class hierarchy might make sense, but in the big picture, when you look at the whole chain, it doesn't make sense. So this, for example, happens when different aspects or closely associated concepts are merged into one item. So, for example, Mason the person and Mason the profession are slightly different, and if they're treated in the same item, then some of those relationships can become nonsensical. Another thing we have is structural bugs, and there's different types of structural bugs we've seen. One of them is subclass off cycles, when we basically have cycles in our class hierarchy. So let's say this is created if a class A has a subclass B and B is a superclass of A again. And this makes it really hard to figure out which of those concepts is actually more specific than another one, which is one of the rather important things to know for querying and inference and so on. And here you can see some examples of where we found those. Then another type of structural bug is a mix-up of meta levels. And this occurs when we inconsistently use instance of versus subclass of on the same item. Like here, egg waffle is a subclass of waffle, is a subclass of food, but egg waffle is an instance of food. Now you could argue about this. Or here, Central Park is an instance of Urban Park is an instance of park, and Central Park is also an instance of park. There are some problems in this. And this is largely covered in a paper by Brasileiro and some others who really dug into this and found useful examples. Another type of structural bug we found is redundant classification. So an item is both an instance of a class and one of its superclasses. Or redundant generalization, an item is both a subclass of a class and one of its superclasses. And yes, as Nicola is saying, redundancy is a nightmare in general. So this is one of the things that probably happens because when editing on an item, you're looking at it in a very local way, as opposed to looking at the graph as a whole. And this might make it hard to see all the consequences of your edits and how they interact with already existing classifications around it. And then there's also competing needs. Sometimes it makes sense to have a very fine-grained classification, and sometimes the shortcut to the more general classification makes sense. Then the next area of issues is the upper ontology. And here, as a caveat, upper ontology is just hard. It's a huge philosophical debate how to do this, and especially in a project that's trying to cover so many different things. What does upper ontology mean? Yeah, so upper ontology is basically the top. If our classes were building up a class tree, then it's basically what would be at the top. So things like entity and how everything in the end is an entity and things like that. Yeah. So it's hard, especially for a project such as Wikidata, where we're trying to cover such a broad variety of things that we're trying to classify, right? This is much easier for a classification that's just trying to classify one narrow field or one narrow topic area. And here it seems that people care a lot more about local ontology, so getting a good ontology of movies or music or things like that, which is totally fair. And it's less important how that all folds up to the other ontology. Then we have conceptual ambiguity. This is again caused by overloading of entities. And it makes it hard to understand what a statement on that item refers to. So here in the screenshot, for example, we have the item for embassy, and an embassy can either be a location or the institution. So not the place you go to, but the organization you go to. And depending on which type of embassy you're talking about, of course, different statements make sense. We have quite a few cases in Wikidata where we have this conceptual ambiguity in items, and it's partially inherited from Wikipedia, where there would probably not be two different Wikipedia articles about this, but instead one Wikipedia article that covers both aspects. And yeah, Andy is saying this is the case for embassies, museums, hospitals, schools. It's basically everywhere. And sometimes it's just easier to keep overloading than to split for convenience. And maybe the alternative would be even worse, where you would significantly increase the number of items that we have and have to take care of. And then another class of problems we have is inconsistent modeling. This occurs when similar kinds of data are modeled in different ways. We can see this both across domains and within a single domain. So here in the examples, you have mauve as an instance of color and a subclass of violet. So here we think some of this comes from lack of common domain understanding that's shared between the people working on the particular topic, or there are just several ways of modeling the same data, and we haven't figured out which one is better or the one we agree on. And sometimes there are very different design decisions taken for different domains. So for example, if you were to build an application that shows movies and you would want to transfer it to music, some of that modeling might be completely different. So it's very hard to adapt your app to work in this adjacent but different topic area. And then another one we see is overgeneralization. So for example, Club Mate here, which is a drink or so, which is classified as a trademark. But it could also be classified as a food brand, which is a brand, which is a trademark, and which maybe would be more appropriate for this drink. And then we have just the world being weird and different people looking at it in a different way. So here we have, resulting from that, conflicting real-world models that we are trying to represent. For example, in the US, we have the 5 Great Lakes, but if you ask a scientist who is into lakes, they will tell you, well, it's actually just 4 because one of them, or 2 of what we consider distinct lakes is actually just one lake. So it's 4. And of course, we want to have that reflected in Wikidata. Yeah, and then Pluto is another good example of that, where it gets interesting, let's say. Some of the things we have in Wikidata, like qualifiers, really help us here, but it's still hard. Okay, and then the last one is something that people brought up last time I presented this classification, something we missed, is unclassified items. So items on Wikidata where we have no statement that says that it belongs, that is an instance of something or a subclass of something, or something related to that. So we don't actually know how it fits into the classes that we have. And this seems to especially happen a lot when we create new items for Wikipedia articles that have been written, and then no one comes to flesh that item out. And now that I've shown you all these different types of problems, I have a bunch of questions for you, which is, which of those issues have you seen in your work in Wikidata or trying to build applications on top of Wikidata? Can you think of any that we are missing? And then which ones of those are actually really bad for trying to build applications on top of Wikidata, which are really hindering you to build on top of Wikidata or even to do work on Wikidata itself when editing? Yeah, and then once we figured out which one's the worst, how can we think about what type of tools and so on can we think about that would help us address those? What would be helpful in editing workflows and tools to make those less likely to occur? And with that, I would love to hear from you. Frederick is saying, I've seen pretty much all of these. Yes, that's good to hear, I guess, and not so good to hear at the same time. Okay, Arthur is saying, I think the upper ontology issues are annoying, but not really serious problems for most practical users. Generally in Wikidata Query Service, you're looking at more detailed parts of our ontology, not the upper level. Yes, so far this is also my impression. Then Frederick is saying, chat is scrolling by too fast, sorry. One particular problems are entities that could be considered both instances and subclasses, and even I'm challenged to say which is right. BT is saying the worst one is when the subclass of transitivity is giving nonsensical results. Okay. Peter is saying the issues are hard because the human race has never done anything like this before. Thank you, Peter. Yes, this is probably part of the problem, that we're trying something that's just inherently really, really hard. Yeah. And then Nicola saying another related issue is what to do when sources diverge. Like some database says X is in Europe, some say it's in France. Should we store only the best one, both with ranks, something else? This is a simple problem, but we apparently can't find an agreed upon solution. Okay, yeah. Then Bart is saying, I've seen all of this as well. The inheritance from Wikipedia is an interesting one. It's also part of what I've been discussing in this session later today. Ah, yeah, that sounds like a session we should go to. Harold is suggesting unclassified items simply make everything entity, automatically a member of the class entity by default. But does that really help us to know what it's about? think it doesn't solve our underlying problem of wanting to know what this item represents and how it fits into what we have. Renat is suggesting to address some of those issues. What about providing the editing rights for P31 and P279, so instance of and subclass of, only to few administrators from the Wiki project ontology? Oh, okay. Yeah, what do people think about that? One thing we have discussed in the team was that before we take quite such drastic measures, it might be an option to start by making those classifying statements somehow special in a similar way as we do the external identifiers and constraints definitions on properties, to help people understand that they are different and should probably be treated with a bit more care, and where we could even have some meaningful help to help them understand that. Okay. Nikki is saying that unclassified items are probably not particularly problematic, just not very useful. Yes, that's a good point. Tony is saying redundancy is okay. Ontologies can be lean or contain all conclusions or something in between. This allows adding sources related to classification. Seems people are not super thrilled about limiting editing rights for subclass of an instance of. TBT is saying P31 and P279's special, just like in the original Wikidata proposal. I don't remember there was something special about those in the original proposal. I have to read that up again. And Arthur is suggesting it would be useful if the ontology was more integrated in the advanced search page, like limit search, for instance, of something or a subclass of something, etc. Arthur, can you expand on what you mean? Thanks, TBT. I have to read up on that history, apparently. Toby is pointing out that it's amazing that we got to 279 before we invented P279. Yeah, it took us a bit of discussion, I think. And after is clarifying the search, you can use has WB statements in the search, yep, to get only instances of person, for example, and this is very useful. Yes. And you would want has WB statement exposed more so that people understand it and find it. Yeah. And yes, those two being so far apart does deserve weird things we didn't say post. If you're not in that group on Facebook and you are on Facebook, I recommend joining it. There's good stuff there. All right. Let me get back to overview. So in your experience, which ones of those do you feel are most problematic when thinking about building applications on top of our data? And also, is anything missing from this list that you think is important? And Nicola is saying inconsistent modeling and redundancy is the worst. Some +1s for inconsistent modeling. Yep. And Frederick is saying semantic drift and conceptual ambiguity is bad for using performing arts data. Okay. And Kat is pointing out that it's not that inconsistent modeling is the problem, it's the lack of social processes to support discussions in these contrasting models. Yeah, this is also one of the things that that we took away from this work so far, which is why I'm trying to get an understanding of which ones of those people generally consider important to fix, and then figure out, like, okay, what, for example, what kind of better social processes and tools to support those processes do we need to get a handle on this? Harold is saying that if you want to know why he thinks that it's missing, that Wikidata is missing formal semantics is one of the most problematic issues, then you should come to the talk tomorrow in the Wikibase track. Yes, this sounds like something we should go to. David is saying overgeneralization is quite bad because it prevents relevant entities from appearing in Sparkle queries. And these cases aren't easily identified. Yeah. Okay, SJ is saying clustering in general, so that touches on conceptual ambiguity, multiple senses for a single item, and semantic drift, and some of the inconsistencies in modeling. And TBT is pointing out that we have constraint checks that would catch semantic ambiguity already. And is the problem that we don't have those constraints defined, or is the problem that we're not fixing the constraints that are triggered? Toby is asking if someone can write this onto the Wiki project ontology page. Yes. I can share my slides later, and we can continue the discussion there as well. Okay, and Frederick is saying inconsistent modeling is a big problem in all domains, but it doesn't only come out of conceptual ambiguity. Items about indigenous nations are related to one another using both subclass of and part of relationships. I suspect this particular problem stems from philosophical and ethical motivations. Yes, that also definitely plays a role in it. And it's a fine line we have to walk, right, between providing very neat and tidy and super usable data and providing data that actually, in a fair, just, equitable way, represents the real world sometimes. Peter is saying that we need the equivalent of 404 not found for ontology not consistent. And the world will find ways of solving it. Yeah, maybe that is part of the solution, being very explicit about Wikidata not being a super neat and tidy ontology. And Harold is saying for proper ontology design, you need to be A, an expert in ontology design, as well as B, an expert in the subject you are modeling. We should find ways to bring together these two groups of people at Wikidata and provide suitable interfaces for collaborative ontology modeling. Yeah. My hope is that, for example, with shape expressions, if they're better integrated and more understandable, we can make quite some progress. But we're definitely not there yet. And Kat is pointing out another problem, that discussions of contrasting models are often fragmented. Some people have these conversations on talk pages of items, some have them in wiki project pages, some have them on the project chat, some have them on Twitter or even Telegram. And due to the variety of places where these conversations happen, many people who are interested in may not be able or may not be aware of all of those discussions. Yeah, that is definitely also a problem. So yes, we need to keep these discussions going. Do you think the Wiki project ontology would be the right place, or is there something better? Yeah. Discussion and conversations are great. However, how will there be a process to reach and implement a decision? Yeah, I think we have to get to that, and I think it would be easier to get to that once we know which issues we're trying to solve first, and then this process to come to agreement needs to be part of the solution. Andrew is suggesting something that Andrew said earlier. A good video of a case study on how to clean up an ontology would be useful. We tried to do ontology cleanup with some editor sounds in the past. We should try more of them. Yeah. Part of an editing session also on that we record. That could be useful. True. And then Amy is saying sometimes it can be difficult to understand whether a consensus was reached when reading through talk pages and so on. So maybe we need better ways to document certain decisions that have been reached. A little ontologize button on Wikidata pages. Okay, that lets you flag an ontology issue. SJ, I like ontologize with an exclamation mark. And he's saying if the wider community don't understand the issues, cleaning will be like playing whack-a-mole. Yeah, and that's exactly why I think we need to integrate it in tools. Like, right, the constraint checks, for example, was the start of formalizing some of those decisions more in code and in machine-readable format, so we can then show it, for example, in the UI when you're making an edit that what you just did is probably not so great. And I don't think we've reached the potential of that yet. There's still quite a bit more that we can do in this direction to support people in making the right edits when we have decisions. Okay, then there's the question, could the mismatch finder tool help? Maybe. It might surface some issues that are caused by ontology issues. I don't think it will be the tool that will specifically help with ontology issues, but some of the conflicting data between Wikidata and another database that it's supposed to show you might be caused by some issues in the ontology. Andrew is saying just a small issue to create a case study is often hard because you need to document the fixing along the way. You cannot show a Wikidata query of poor practices of the past or a Wikidata graph builder visualization of the prefix bad ontology. Yeah, this is a good point. And Kat is saying currently it's possible to find differences in usage guidelines on a property with what is encoded in the constraints on that property with a schema in namespace E. It can be very confusing for people if they aren't sure which of those to follow. Yeah, this is not good. It would be interesting to see an example of that, Kat, if you have one, so that we can find out what the cause of those differences was. And then we have how do we go forward with following a set of ontology guidelines if our decisions can easily be overwritten by a bot, which we unfortunately have experienced hundreds of times with items getting overwritten by a bot. Yeah, this is something I think if we have more constraints and entity schemas and similar machine readable ways of encoding the modeling decisions we have made, then the next step I would say is forcing bots to follow those and be in line with those machine readable, available to them encoding of those modeling decisions. And stopping those bots or imports if they don't follow that. But those then are community processes that we might need to improve as well once we have the right tools in place. And SJ is saying that we could use more visibility for entity schemas. And luckily enough, there will be a session later today, I believe, to teach you how to write entity schemas and how they are awesome. And you should all go there because they are indeed awesome. And Toby is asking if bots are really causing any of those issues. Yes. At least the missing classification is to a very large extent caused by bots creating new items for articles, which is good, but need cleanup. And I've also seen, for example, items that are covering two concepts because at some point a bot imported an identifier from a Wikipedia, for example, into it that didn't quite fit. So, for example, it was for music duo, but the identifier was just for one person or the other way around. And that leads to a lot of mixing up of concepts and items. Wrong instance of and subclass of statements and so on. So at least those are two problems I've seen caused at scale by bots. Right, we have about 5 minutes left. Let me go back to the questions. And I wonder if people have more thoughts on any of those questions now for the last 5 minutes. And Amy is asking, how do we better promote use of relevant schemas once established to editors who may be unaware of them? Yeah, I think this is largely on my team and me to figure out ways how to better integrate that in the user interface and tools and so on. Because it doesn't matter if we just have the definition in the entity schema, but we don't use it. Yeah. Nika is asking, when is the next talk about this special event? If you would like a special event about this, we can sure look into that, yes. And Andy is suggesting maybe we need a blog post or something similar aimed at people who edit items without the bigger picture, the bigger graph in mind. Yeah, that might also be helpful, and that would be a good resource to point people to who might need a bit of help understanding that. I think we have this page on Wikidata called Basic Membership Properties. I don't know how widespread its use is, but that should explain some of that, but maybe it can be improved. Oh, Peter is saying, don't underestimate the value of what Wikidata is and is doing. It will change the world, though it may take 20 years. But Peter, yesterday, it should be yesterday that we want to change the world, right? Tiago's answering why is it so hard? For biology, much data comes from external databases which treat classes as individuals and make no explicit ontological commitments. Also, field researchers have little or no training in conceptual modeling. That's very possible. All right. And with that, I think we're reaching the end of it. Yes, exactly that page, Andy. Thank you so much for all your input. That was super helpful. And we will continue the discussion. There seems to be interest in a special event on this, so we will definitely check that out. And go to the schema session, go to the ontology session in the Wikibase track. And yeah, thank you so much.